Good, everyone. Welcome to our latest Econ talk. Gareth, we've had the Reserve Bank announcement for April come out. Very different circumstances to where the Reserve Bank thought they might have been. We were continuing to hope that there were better economic times showing through. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in the middle of the worst oil price shock and oil supply shock since the 1970s, if not before then. The Reserve Bank playing things with a fairly straight bat, no change to the official cash rate, staying at 2.25%. But what I feel like we're terming now a bit of a hawkish hold coming through. The Reserve Bank saying, look, they've got all of the normal settings that they're currently applying to an oil price shock. They're not going to overreact to immediate inflation concerns, but they did seem a little bit more worried about the potential pass-through in costs over time. What did you make of the statement?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a couple of the keys were just around the sort of vigilance that the Reserve Bank talked about that they will have in terms of watching for those second round price effects and more inflationary pressures potentially building through the system. And there was no talk of thinking about a cut because of the supply shock that's hitting us and what that will do around the sort of demand across the economy as people's incomes get squeezed and they have less money to spend on everything else apart from petrol. It was very much focused on, yes, there's inflationary risks out there. We're watching for those. We don't want to go too early, and fair enough. And they will be having to watch a lot of indicators, I think, over the next few months to try and just understand better how those inflationary pressures might be coming through. But yes, it certainly did move away from, it was less balanced, I suppose, than what the Reserve Bank speech that the governor gave a couple of weeks earlier, which was very, very orthodox. Here's the upside risks, here's the downside risks. This was much more looking on the upside risks in terms of that inflation. And what was also interesting, of course, in terms of the statement that came out was the Reserve Bank unusually putting out some forecasts, not many, but some forecasts alongside what is normally just the sort of brief statement in between monetary policy statements they do from every quarter. And there we saw the bank predicting inflation hitting above 4%. In the June quarter as well. So just giving us an idea of where that might sit. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. That is the issue, right? When you're looking at the situation, I mean, the Reserve Bank had based those forecasts on futures markets from the day before and what oil prices were showing. And then, 2 hours before the Reserve Bank comes out with its statement, we've got news of a ceasefire. Very fragile ceasefire, I'd have to say, but news of a ceasefire, oil prices dropping by somewhere in the order of $10 to $15 a barrel as well. So, your assumptions and your forecasts can be thrown out from one day to the next, given how fluid that situation over in the Middle East seems to be.
Definitely, but you're right that, I mean, the bank was at pains to highlight very quickly in its statement as well, like at the end of the first paragraph, it highlighted, that it was vigilant to the risks, and most importantly, that how decisive, that was their word, not anyone else's, they would be if they needed to try and lop off the top of inflation if you started to see that sort of medium-term inflation expectation increase, if you saw that sort of continued pass-through emerging. I think importantly as well, that was effectively because they're looking at what happened 5 years ago and went, wow, last time we sort of let the cat get out of the bag, we really didn't sort of pull things back nearly quickly enough. And so the bank was sort of quite clear to highlight that is now the intention, that they won't move immediately. They don't need to move immediately. But they're also not scared of having to at the minute that it's a bit clearer that sort of circumstance is warranted. And I think that's useful. I think also, though, the bank did highlight and that sort of went through some of the conversations that committee members had in making that decision around, some who said, look, are we better if we need to move early, to move preemptively, to increase interest rates quicker and maybe more so that we don't have to sort of prolong the pain or maybe even have to increase interest rates even more if we go slow and we don't get things under control. But that was equally balanced by people saying, do we sort of kick the knees out from under the economy when it's already in a tough space? There's still a lot of, spare capacity in the economy and everything else. So I think a fairly balanced statement coming through from the Reserve Bank. I mean, what's the expectation going forward from here? The bank didn't say, look, this is the date that we're currently thinking about. They're never quite so, direct. But there seems to be quite a spread of views out there. What's ours and what are we sort of thinking happens going forward?
Yeah, so we have been bringing forward our expected start to the tightening cycle anyway, even prior to the conflict kicking off in the Middle East. But given the sort of risks around that, given the conversations that we've been having with businesses where there is a sense that there are more cost increases coming through the system that businesses are facing, there is less scope for businesses to sort of absorb cost pressures and cost increases because their profitability has been squeezed over the last 3 years by weak economic conditions anyway. There's a sense from us that inflation will pick up, and some of those second round effects that the Reserve Bank is worried about could become problematic. So we brought forward the timing of when we expect the interest rate to start rising from the Reserve Bank forward to July this year now. So we had been thinking December. We brought that forward to September. Now we're looking at July. There is, as you say, a range of views. Some forecasters are still sticking with a December rate increases being the first one, but the sort of movement or the trend and direction around those forecasts is coming earlier. And also then the question becomes how quickly do they need to lift rates? I think there was a sort of a little bit of a hint in the statement that, maybe 25 basis points at a time, if things look like they're getting out of control, might not be enough and they might move more sharply. And certainly when you're looking at where the peak on those interest rates might be further out into 2027, it's now looking more like a peak of 4%, maybe even a bit higher than the sort of 3% or 3 to 3.5% that we might have been thinking as well. So a bit of work to be done by the Reserve Bank. A lot of uncertainty still out there as to exactly how things unfold, but the sort of trend in direction, the trend in movement is looking more and more clear, I think.
And I think, look, to be clear, like you say, that uncertainty is extreme. There's still a lot that can happen between now and the next time the Reserve Bank meets, which is the end of May. Importantly, that next decision will have a full suite of forecasts, and clearly, it'll be a difficult one for the Reserve Bank's forecasting team to figure out what's going on at that point and sort of the evolution up until the publish. And then, of course, the day after the Reserve Bank statement, the budget comes out from the government, which again will have to try and cope and handle this extreme amount of uncertainty and everything else. So a lot of difficult, movements still to try and understand. Realistically, I think also the reason we're looking at July, right, is because that's probably the first that you probably have enough information to be making a more definitive call, but still a lot of water to go under the bridge. Thing I'm really appreciating looking through the Reserve Bank statements is that they're fairly comprehensive. Definitely don't agree with everything in there. That's great. That's healthy. But there is a lot of information, a lot more sort of colour and detail around sort of both sides of the argument and what the Reserve Bank is having to consider and toss up. And that was helped, of course, by having the Reserve Bank Governor and a few members of the Monetary Policy Committee do a effectively web conference, webinar after the publishing of the statement or of the review this time, which just again adds a little bit more information into the mix and I think is helpful and highlights that transparency coming through from the Reserve Bank. Certainly not a job that I would like at the moment, but useful to understand their thinking. We'll assess that, everything and everything else the Reserve Bank might have to look at, how the government responds and what's happening on the oil shock front on a future Econ talk.